Grace laughed at Mark in couples therapy, full-on cackled, then went home and replayed his shaky voice for her friends like it was a comedy special. She called him soft right in front of the therapist, leaned over like she was sharing gossip, and asked, "Do you got a program for whatever this is?" Mark sat there with his hands clasped so tight his knuckles went pale, trying not to flinch. She wanted him to shrink. She wanted him to feel small in the one room he thought might be safe. Here's how it happened. Mark Bennett was 33, black, raised in Prince George's County, Maryland. The kind of man who held doors, remembered birthdays, and still called older folks Mr. and Ms. even when they insisted he didn't have to. He worked in IT for a contractor in Arlington, steady pay, steady hours, and a steady habit of fixing everybody else's problems before his own. Grace was 34, black, sharp-tongued and bright, the kind of pretty that made people talk to her like they already liked her. They met at a friend's cookout in Bowie, music loud, smoke in the air, laughter bouncing off parked cars. At that cookout, Mark made her laugh for real. Somebody burned the hot dogs, claimed it was cha, and Mark deadpanned, "That ain't cha. That's evidence." Grace laughed so hard she had to hold her stomach, then grabbed his wrist like she didn't want to lose him in the crowd. Later, when the sun dropped and the mosquitoes got bold, Mark offered her his hoodie. She rolled her eyes and said she wasn't cold, but she wore it anyway. That night they sat on the curb sharing a plate, and Grace leaned her head on his shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world. In the beginning, they were the kind of couple people rooted for. Mark wrote little notes on the fridge, dumb jokes, sweet lines, reminders. Grace teased him for being corny but saved every note in a showbox like it was proof that somebody could love her gently. They did date nights in D.C., cheap museum days, late-night slices, holding hands along the wharf. In a photo from that time, Mark looked lighter. Grace smiled with her whole face. Nobody would have guessed how fast tenderness could turn into a weapon when one person decided love was something to control. The shift was quiet at first, like a slow leak you don't notice until the tire's flat. Grace started correcting Mark in public, small stuff meant to sting. "You don't know wine," she'd say at restaurants, then order for him like he was a kid. If he spoke up, she'd laugh and tell people he was sensitive. When he tried to talk about it later, she'd turn it into a joke. Or, "You want a feelings meeting," she'd say, kissing her teeth. Mark kept trying anyway because he believed marriage was effort, not performance. They married at a small venue in Hyattsville, surrounded by black family in bright colors, aunties fanning themselves, uncles arguing over music like it was a sport. Mark cried during the vows, and Grace smiled like she'd won something. After the ceremony, Mark danced with her under string lights, whispering that he'd choose her every day. Grace laughed, pressed her forehead to his, and said, "Then keep choosing right." It sounded romantic then. Mark didn't hear the warning tucked inside it. Like choosing her meant choosing whatever version of reality she decided to hand him. Once they settled into life, Grace's mother became a constant shadow in their home. Ms. Denise never called Mark by his name at first. Just that boy, even though Mark paid half the mortgage and fixed her car without complaining. Grace's sister, Tasha, had opinions on everything, especially Mark. If Mark bought a new couch, Tasha said it looked cheap. If he planned a family trip, she asked if he could even afford it. Grace didn't defend him. She watched him take it and smirked like she was testing how much disrespect he'd swallow. Mark tried to keep romance alive anyway. On their first anniversary, he booked a weekend in Baltimore, in a harbor, seafood, walking along the water. He got the matching hoodies that said Bennett Crew as a joke. Grace wore hairs long enough to take pictures, then changed and told him he was doing too much. That night in the hotel, she scrolled her phone while he talked about their future, nodding like she was listening. When he reached for her hand, she pulled away and said, "You always need something." Mark smiled like it didn't hurt. It did. The humiliation got sharper as she got bolder. Grace started calling Mark therapy boy whenever he expressed emotion. If he said he was stressed, she mocked his tone. If he asked for respect, she laughed and told him he was trying to be the man now. Once, at a friend's birthday in D.C., she told everyone Mark cried during an argument about laundry. People laughed because Grace laughed first. Mark's face burned. He excused himself to the bathroom and stayed at his reflection, asking himself why he felt ashamed for being human. Then the weekend started disappearing. Grace would claim she was with the girls in Alexandria or helping Tasha in Baltimore, but the stories didn't line up. She'd come home smelling like perfume that wasn't hers, phone face down, mood swinging between cold and cruel. When Mark asked simple questions, she accused him of being controlling. "You sound like my ex," she'd spit, even though Mark didn't know much about her ex beyond the way Grace used him as a threat. Mark began keeping receipts of his own reality, texts, dates, times, because Grace kept rewriting the past. Mark suggested couples therapy after a night when Grace screamed at him for walking too loud in their own house. He didn't want to fight. He wanted help. He picked a therapist in Silver Spring with good reviews and experience with marriage conflict. Mark told Grace it could be a restart, like, "Hey, let's learn each other again." Grace agreed too quickly, smiling like she'd been waiting for this chance. Mark felt hopeful. He shouldn't have. Grace didn't go to therapy to heal. She went to therapy to win, and she treated Mark's pain like a weakness to exploit. The first session, Grace showed up polished, edges laid, lipstick perfect, perfume expensive. Mark wore a simple sweater and carried a notebook because he didn't trust himself to remember everything under pressure. The therapist, Dr. Renee Carter, a black woman with calm eyes, set ground rules. No interrupting, no name-calling, stay curious. Grace nodded like an angel. Then Mark spoke about feeling lonely in his own marriage, about how Grace's family disrespected him. Grace leaned back and smiled, then laughed. "Lonely," she echoed. "In a whole house. Be serious." Mark's throat tightened, and Grace watched it happen. Session after session, Grace performed cruelty like it was talent. She mimicked Mark's voice. She rolled her eyes when he said he missed being held. She called him dramatic, needy, embarrassing. Dr. Carter kept redirecting, asking Grace to speak without sarcasm. Grace would behave for 30 seconds, then slip right back into laughter and shame. Mark started dreading the drive to Silver Spring. He'd sit in the parking lot breathing through anxiety while Grace adjusted her hair in the mirror and said, "Don't cry in there today. I'm tired of you." Then she'd smile and walk in first. Outside therapy, Grace used the sessions like a script. If Mark told Dr. Carter he felt abandoned, Grace would repeat it at home in a baby voice. Or, "You feel abandoned," she'd sing while pouring a drink, like his pain was background music. If Mark mentioned trust issues, Grace would leave her phone open just enough to show a new message thread, then lock it and laugh. Mark started sleeping lightly, waking up to her moving around at night, whispering into her phone. He'd ask who it was, and Grace would say, "Mind your business," like marriage had boundaries only for him. Mark's friends noticed the change. He stopped joking as much. He showed up late, left early. A close friend from college, Donnell, pulled him aside at a gym in Lanham and said, "You don't look right, bro." Mark almost told him everything but stopped because shame stuck to his tongue. Grace had trained him to believe his hurt was something ridiculous. When he finally tried to open up, Donnell frowned and said, "That ain't normal." Mark nodded like he agreed. But the next day, Grace called Donnell a bad influence and told Mark his friends were jealous. Isolation is quieter than people think. The romantic moments became traps. Mark would try to cook Grace's favorite salmon, light candles, put on old-school R&B. Grace would walk in, glance at the table, and say, "What you trying to do?" "Buy forgiveness." Mark would swallow the insult and say, "I just want us." Grace would smirk and respond, "Then be a man." Sometimes she'd accept the romance just to mock it later, telling her sister, "He thinks candles fix everything." Mark felt like he was auditioning for the role of good husband while Grace sat in the front row throwing tomatoes. One of the funniest moments, funny in a sad way, came when Mark tried to surprise Grace with a dance lesson in D.C. He thought they could laugh together again. The instructor was cheerful, the music sweet, and Mark was genuinely trying. Grace spent the whole class making faces at herself in the mirror, laughing when Mark stepped on her toe, loudly saying, "Ouch, see? He can't lead." When they got to the car, Mark apologized. Grace said, "You can't lead in dance or life. then turned up the radio. Mark stared out the window at the city lights, feeling like he was disappearing in plain sight. Then came the custody threat, the moment that turned Mark's stomach into stone. After an argument about Grace coming home late again, she looked Mark in the eye and said, "You know what? I'll take our child and you'll never see us again." Mark froze. Grace smiled like she'd found the ultimate weapon. "And don't think therapy gonna save you," she added. "I can make you look crazy." Mark's chest tightened. He wasn't a perfect man, but he'd never been violent, never been reckless. He was a father who packed lunches and checked homework. Grace was telling him the truth. She was willing to lie if it got her power. A month later, Grace filed for divorce in Upper Marlborough and asked for primary custody, claiming Mark was emotionally unstable and controlling. The language in the paperwork felt like a stranger wrote it, until Mark recognized Grace's phrases, the same insult she used at home. Grace moved into her mother's place in Bowie without warning, taking their child for a few days that turned into weeks. Mark texted politely. Grace answered rarely, only to twist the knife. "Stop harassing me," she wrote after he asked when he could see his child. Then she told people he was scaring her. Mark felt like reality was cracking under his feet. Mark hired an attorney in Maryland, Ms. Patrice Holloway, a black woman with a quiet voice and eyes that missed nothing. In their first meeting, Mark tried to stay composed, but his words kept tripping over emotion. Ms. Holloway didn't laugh. She slid him a box of tissues like it was normal to break under pressure. "We're going to deal with facts," she said. Mark told her about therapy, about Grace's mocking, about the threats. Ms. Holloway asked one question that made Mark pause. "Do you have any proof of how she behaves when she thinks nobody's watching?" Mark almost said no. Then he remembered something. Because Mark had been so desperate to understand what was happening, he'd started keeping a private journal. Dates, quotes, times, nothing dramatic, just a record of his own life. He also remembered the therapy paperwork Dr. Carter had them sign at intake, confidentiality, rules, and a line about sessions possibly being recorded for clinical quality with consent. Mark hadn't thought much of it then. Now, Ms. Holloway requested records from Dr. Carter. Grace's attorney objected immediately, claiming privilege. Ms. Holloway didn't argue in public. She filed motions quietly, patiently, like someone who knew the law moved at the speed of paperwork but still moved. Grace, meanwhile, strutted through the process like she'd already won. She told mutual friends Mark was obsessed, said he was stalking her because he asked for parenting time. She laughed in family group chats when Mark's name came up, sending clown emojis. Ms. Denise called Mark and told him a real man wouldn't beg. Mark hung up and sat on his couch in silence so thick it felt physical. The worst part wasn't even the insults, it was the abandonment. People he'd fed, helped, and shown up for were suddenly acting like Grace's story was easier than the truth. Mark learned how loneliness can make a strong person feel weak. Still, small flickers of tenderness survived, mostly because Mark refused to let Grace poison everything good in him. When he finally got a supervised visit at a center in Largo, he showed up early with snacks and a little toy he knew his child would like. He kept his voice calm, his smile real. He didn't talk about court. He just played, listened, and stayed present. The supervisor watched him closely at first, then relaxed when she saw how natural he was. Mark drove home afterward and cried in the car, not because he was ashamed, but because he missed his child so badly it felt like grief. Grace never asked how the visit went. She didn't care. The court process dragged through months, and Grace stayed cruel. During one exchange, she leaned close enough for Mark to smell her perfume and whispered, "You're done." She smiled like she expected him to crumble. Mark didn't respond. He just buckled his child into the car seat carefully and said, "Have a good day," to his child, not to her. That silence made Grace angrier than any argument. She wanted a reaction. She wanted proof that Mark was unstable. Instead, Mark started building routines. Gym, therapy for himself, better sleep. Not as a performance, as survival. Then Grace made the mistake she thought was genius. She submitted evidence to the court, audio clips from couples therapy that painted Mark as panicked, tearful, unreasonable. Her attorney framed it like Mark was emotionally volatile. Grace smirked in the courtroom in Upper Marlboro like she was watching the final scene of a movie she wrote. Mark's stomach dropped when he heard his own voice. Tight, shaky, broken. He felt exposed, like somebody peeled his skin off in front of strangers. Grace glanced back at him and mouthed, "Crazy." No remorse. Just hunger for humiliation. Ms. Holloway stayed calm. She requested the full recordings and metadata, challenging the edits and the legality. Under Maryland's two-party consent rules, secretly recording private conversations can be illegal, and Dr. Carter testified that her practice retained secure, time-stamped session files for clinical documentation under their signed consent agreement. Grace's clips didn't match the official timestamps. The judge granted an order for the complete, authenticated session audio. Grace's face tightened for the first time, not with guilt, just irritation that she couldn't control the narrative anymore. She didn't apologize. She doubled down, whispering to her lawyer like it was all some inconvenience. When the full session audio played in court, it wasn't dramatic like TV. It was worse because it was ordinary cruelty, clean, casual, undeniable. Grace's laughter filled the room when Mark spoke about feeling alone. Grace's mocking voice repeated his words like a playground bully. Grace bragged, clear as day, that therapy was useful because Mark talks too much and she could use it. At one point, Grace joked that she could make him look unstable if she needed custody leverage. Her tone wasn't emotional. It was practical. The judge's face didn't change much, but the courtroom air changed. Mark stared at the table, heart pounding, hearing his own humiliation return as proof. The judge ruled without theatrics. Primary custody to Mark. A structured parenting plan with supervised exchanges for Grace until further review. Sanctions for submitting manipulated evidence. And a referral for potential legal consequences related to unlawful recording and misrepresentation. Grace didn't cry. She didn't say sorry. She stood up like she was bored, grabbed her bag, and walked out with her chin high, like consequences was something that happened to other people. Outside, she hissed at Mark, "This ain't over." Mark didn't answer. He just breathed, deep and shaky, like his body was learning what relief felt like after months underwater. Karma didn't show up as fireworks. It showed up as paperwork, quiet doors closing, and Grace's own choices circling back. Her job in Arlington did an internal review after the case details surfaced through routine legal disclosures. Recording professionals without consent, bringing private clinical content into litigation, and the pattern of conduct created risks they didn't want. Grace wasn't marched out in handcuffs on the news. She was simply let go during a restructuring, benefits ending, access revoked, her badge quietly deactivated. No applause. No viral moment. Just a private collapse of the stability she'd used to feel untouchable. She still showed no remorse, only anger that control slipped. Mark's transformation stayed private too. No speeches, no posts, no "look what I survived" performance. He moved to a smaller place in Bowie with sunlight in the kitchen and peace in the hallways. He kept therapy, not to prove anything, but to heal what Grace tried to break. He cooked dinner with music on and danced with his child in socks, laughing when they both got the steps wrong. Sometimes he still remembered Grace's laugh and felt a sting, but it didn't own him anymore. The moral lesson Mark carried was simple. Love that requires you to accept humiliation isn't love, it's control. Real love protects your dignity, even in hard moments. And real healing starts the day you stop begging someone to be kind. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.